Of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week a new national poll was released by respected pollster Patrick Goodell, a Democrat, and John McLaughlin, a Republican, making clear that the American people still don't feel they know the truth about what happened in Benghazi nearly 14 months ago. According to the poll commissioned by Secure America Now, 63% of Americans, quote, think the Obama administration is covering up the facts about Benghazi, end of quote, and only 29% of registered voters say the Obama administration has been honest about Benghazi. Think about that for a moment. A supermajority of Americans believe they have been misled by their government about what happened in Benghazi. This is remarkable. The American people know how significant it is that Ambassador Stevens, the president's personal envoy to Libya, was the first ambassador killed in the line of duty in 4 decades on September 11 years to the day that nearly 3,000 people were killed by al-Qaeda terrorists. The American people intuitively understand that a plot of this scale was not spontaneously inspired as claimed by the administration's now infamous talking points. The American people also know that it's remarkable that no effort was made by Washington to rescue the Americans in Benghazi or dispatch a hostage rescue team after the ambassador went missing that night. I think the American people also wonder just what the CIA was doing in Benghazi. Was it involved in the collection and transfer of weapons to foreign countries, possibly to support the Syrian rebels? And could some of those weapons have fallen into the wrong hands, like the Syrian jihadists? It is too easy to say that this is, quote, classified information and expect the American people to look away. 4 Americans were killed that night, several were wounded, and no one came to help them. Was it because the CIA was conducting a covert operation, and if something went wrong, that was just the price of doing business? Were the CIA activities in Benghazi part of the reason the consulate and annex were targeted? These are legitimate questions the American people are asking that deserve clear answers. The McLaughlin-Goodell poll also found that 62% of the American people support creating a, quote, special bipartisan committee with broad powers to get to the truth about the attacks in Benghazi. 83% of Republicans, 58% of independents support the idea. Notably, nearly half of Democrats said it was important to create a bipartisan committee to learn the truth. Bottom line, Americans from across the political spectrum recognize that not only are they not being told the truth, but they feel Congress needs to change its approach to the investigation by creating a special committee. Why is it, despite more than a year of investigations in 5 separate committees, the American people feel they still don't know the truth about what happened? Perhaps it's because, despite more than a year of investigations by 5 committees, most of the questions raised about that night remain unanswered. Perhaps it's because, despite more than a year of investigation by 5 committees, hardly any of the key witnesses responsible for the government's response that night, or lack thereof, have publicly, and the key word is publicly, testified. Perhaps it is because, despite more than a year of investigations, none of the survivors that could help answer key questions have publicly testified before Congress. Perhaps it is because, despite more than a year of investigations, so few committee hearings have been held publicly. Or perhaps it's because, despite more than a year of investigations, what little the American people have learned have come from news reports from CNN, CBS, Fox, and other news organizations, and not from congressional hearings or testimony. I think all these factors have contributed to the sense among the American people that Congress has failed in its oversight responsibility. The American people know they haven't been told the full story about what happened that night, and they believe they have been intentionally misled by the administration. I've come to the floor today to once again call on my leadership to create a House Select Committee on Benghazi. I'm often asked what is holding up the creation of the Select Committee. The simple answer is because the Speaker has not agreed to it. I like the Speaker. He has a tough job, and he may have good reasons for not wanting to establish a Select Committee, but I don't know what it is, and more importantly, I don't think the American people know what it is. Let me be clear, my criticism is not with any of the chairmen of committees that are looking into this. They're all good men. They have worked very hard. Their hands are tied. They are required, though, to stay within their jurisdictional lanes, examining only what they are allowed to investigate according to their committee charter. What happened in Benghazi is interrelated. The lanes crisscross. The White House, the State Department, the CIA, the Defense Department were all involved, resulting in overlapping but uncoordinated investigations. Benghazi was a terrorist attack. We need a team effort to find out what happened, why it happened, and how we are going to bring the perpetrators to justice. Any of these chairmen would be capable of leading the Select Committee, and other members of their committees would be very good to serve as well. They would do a good job. I have confidence in them. And let me be clear, I have no intention of chairing or serving on the Select Committee. I will not serve on the Select Committee. I just want to learn the truth, just like the American people. There is a history in Congress that when things overlap between committees and transcend jurisdictions, select committees were established. Two well-known examples, Watergate and Iran-Contra. I am submitting for the record a list of the past select committees over the past 50 years, which will be at the end of my statement. A select committee would take members from each committee with their individual expertise, and many of the members from these various committees have tremendous expertise, and have them work on this investigation day in and day out with no other distractions. It would also prevent the administration from saying one thing to one committee of jurisdiction and something else to another. I am reminded of the poem, The Blind Men and the Elephant, which is said to have originated in India. In the poem, 6 blind men touch a part of an elephant, and each provides a different description of what the elephant must look like. They argue at great length between themselves, and the poem ends by saying, while each is partly right, they are all wrong. The moral of the poem is that independently, people may think their understanding of the situation is correct, yet they don't know the truth until the full picture comes into focus. Each of the 5 committees may not be seeing the entire picture of what happened that night. Regular order has limited the committees from going beyond their jurisdictions. One group ought to have the responsibility to get to the bottom of all parts of this tragedy. One group needs to lay out a roadmap to obtaining and reporting that information to the American people so we can restore confidence that Congress has a serious oversight plan on Benghazi. Remember, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We need to see the whole of this tragedy. My bill to create a select committee, H-Res 36, now has 178 co-sponsors, more than 3/4 of the Republican conference, more than a supermajority of the majority. Nearly 3/4 of the Republican members who serve on the committees already investigating Benghazi now support a select committee. That means the plurality of the members who have been directly involved in committee investigations believe a select committee would be a more effective approach. The bills have been endorsed by the American Legion, representing so many vets who sacrificed and gave their time and effort to serve this country. The Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, which represents the diplomatic security agents that were present in Benghazi. The people who represent them who were present in Benghazi support the Select Committee. Groups also representing the highly respected special ops community who serve this nation so well. The editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. Perhaps, most important, it has been endorsed by some of the family members of the Benghazi victims, like Sean Smith's mother and Ty Wood's father, who want to know the truth about what happened to their children that night and why their country fell short in its response. Nothing will bring their children back, but we can at least provide them with the clear answers and assign accountability for those responsible for intelligence failures and the inept response that night. The best way to do this is to break down the stovepipes between the 5 committees, hold public hearings and issue subpoenas to all the survivors from Benghazi, those who were in Tripoli and those who were in Washington responding that night. We need a public hearing with the principals involved in the decision-making process in Washington on September 11, 2012, including former Secretary Panetta, former Secretary of State Clinton, former CIA Director Petraeus, former White House advisor and current CIA Director John Brennan, and former AFRICOM Commander General Ham, as well as the White House. We also need a similar hearing with each of their deputies and others who are witness to the calls for help and the decisions surrounding the response not to help. Unless we hear from these people publicly, the American people will never learn the truth about whether there were warnings prior to the attack, what calls for help were made that night, whether the CIA security team was in fact delayed in leaving to respond to the initial attack at the consulate, and what response was from Washington, among many other questions. Also, the American people should know of the bravery of the men who were there in Benghazi. And until these key individuals are sitting side by side at the witness table, answering questions under oath in public, we will never get a clear picture of who made the decisions that night and why. And again, the hearings must be in public. The American people can handle the truth. Failure to get these answers means there will never be any accountability, which further erodes public confidence in government. Absent a select committee, the Congress will fail to learn the truth about what happened that night because the administration will continue to use the jurisdictional barriers between each committee to continue to slow walk or deny information. There are a number of new developments in recent weeks that make a select committee more timely than ever. First, our colleague Mike Rogers, chairman of the Intelligence Committee, confirmed earlier reports telling Fox News that the plot against the consulate and the CIA annex in Benghazi appears to have been weeks, if not months, in the making, and that at least 2 of the plot's leaders had close connections to senior al-Qaeda leadership. Nearly a year ago, I circulated a memo to all members prepared by respected terrorism analyst Thomas Jocelyn, detailing the apparent connections and likely coordination between al-Qaeda affiliates in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen that resulted in threats and attacks on U.S. diplomatic facilities in those countries the week of September 11, 2012. Unfortunately, the committees have not held public, and again the word public, hearings looking at the connection between these threats. Last week, Fox News' Catherine Herridge first reported that, quote, at least 2 of the key suspects in the Benghazi terror attacks were at one point working with al-Qaeda senior leadership. Sources familiar with the investigation tell Fox News the sources said one of the suspects was believed to be a courier for the Al-Qaeda network and the other a bodyguard in Afghanistan prior to the 2001 terror attacks, end of quote. Catherine Herridge went on and said the direct ties to the Al-Qaeda senior leadership undercut earlier characterizations by the Obama administration that the attackers in Benghazi were isolated extremists, not Al-Qaeda terrorists, with no organizational structure or affiliation, end of quote. And then, on Sunday, CBS 60 Minutes aired a segment by Laura Logan further explaining what happened that night and the increasingly clear connection to Al-Qaeda. And I'm very grateful for 60 Minutes to covering this story. Logan reported that, quote, just a few weeks ago, Abu Anas al-Libi was captured for his role in the Africa bombings, and the U.S. is still investigating what part he may have played in Benghazi. We have learned, she said, that this man, Sufyan bin Kulmu, a former Guantanamo Bay detainee and a long-time Al-Qaeda operative, was one of the lead planners, along with Faraj al-Chalabi, whose ties to Osama bin Laden go back more than 15 years. He's believed to have carried documents from the compound to the head of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, end of quote. It is particularly notable al-Chalabi reportedly delivered documents from U.S. facilities in Benghazi to the head of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, establishing a direct link between Benghazi attacks and the most senior leadership of Al-Qaeda. Among the other revelations in a 60-minute segment, Al-Qaeda stated its intent to attack Americans in Benghazi, along with the Red Cross and the British mission, well in advance of September 11. Lieutenant Colonel Andy Wood, the top American security official in Libya in the months leading up to the attack, told CBS that both the State Department and the Defense Department were well aware of the threat and the attacks on the Red Cross and British missions. And, he said, it was, quote, obvious to the Americans in Libya, obvious, that it was only a matter of time until attack on the U.S. facilities. When the terrorists stormed the consulate property, they said, quote, we're here to kill Americans, not Libyans, end of quote, and they spared the lives of the Libyan guards. Confirmation of that information I detailed on the House floor in July, noting that, quote, a quick reaction force from the CIA annex ignored orders to wait and race to the compound, at times running and shooting their way through the streets just to get there, end of quote. The Americans faced a, quote, professional army as they encountered waves of intense fighting on the CIA annex in Benghazi during the early morning of September 12. Mortars fired during the final wave of the assault hit the roof of the annex 3 times in the dark. Lieutenant Colonel Wood described hitting a target like that as, quote, getting the basketball through the hoop over your shoulder, and that it took, quote, coordination, planning, training, experienced personnel to pull off such a well-executed attack. 2 Delta Force operators who fought at the CIA annex, apparently as part of the impromptu team that flew in from Tripoli with Glenn Doherty during the attack without permission from Washington, have, quote, been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and the Navy Cross, 2 of the military's highest honors. And we owe them a debt of gratitude. The U.S. already knew that senior Al-Qaeda leader Abu Anas al-Libi was in Libya and was tasked by the head of Al-Qaeda to establish a clandestine terrorist network inside the country. Al-Libi was already wanted for his role in bombing 2 embassies in Africa, where constituents from my congressional district were killed. Notably, the administration made no mention of his connection to the Benghazi attacks in its announcement of his capture last month. Some of the key questions that remain unanswered are why the CIA security team was ordered not to respond to the attack at the consulate, and why no larger military response ever crossed the border into Libya, something the U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission Greg Hicks realized wasn't going to happen just an hour into the attack. It is particularly noteworthy that Logan addressed the pressure on witnesses she encountered during her investigation, saying, and here's what she said, quote, "an extraordinary amount of pressure on the people involved not to talk, and an extraordinary amount of pressure on anyone in the government, the military side, the political side, not to say anything out of official channels." This is consistent with the concerns I have repeatedly raised on the floor, House floor, about efforts by this administration to silence survivors and witnesses to the Benghazi attack and response. What are they afraid of, these witnesses sharing with the American people? And how can the Congress stand by and allow this to happen, knowing full well it is taking place? CNN in July reported that, quote, "since January, some CIA operatives involved in the agency's mission in Libya have been subjected to frequent, even monthly polygraph examinations, according to a source with deep inside knowledge of the agency's working. The goal of the questioning, according to sources, is to find out if anyone talking to the media or Congress." That was reported by CNN in July. Fox News, in a separate piece in July, reported, quote, "at least 5 CIA employees were forced to sign additional non-disclosure agreements this past spring in the wake of the Benghazi attack." That's what Fox News said in July of this year. As someone who represents thousands of federal employees and contractors, including many who work for the CIA, the FBI, the State Department, and the Defense Department, I know from years of first-hand experience how agencies can sometimes use various forms of pressure and intimidation to keep employees from sharing information of concern with Congress. I know the Benghazi survivors and other witnesses that night from those agencies need the protection of a friendly subpoena to compel their testimony before Congress, particularly on matters as sensitive as this, in order to protect them. So far, the committees have failed to provide this protection to allow survivors and other witnesses to allow them to share their story publicly so the American people can hear them. Based on disclosures in recent news reports, I now believe that the Benghazi plot represents a significant intelligence failure by the United States at several levels. Understanding these failures, as well as the government's inexplicable response during and after the attack, is critical to preventing future attacks. I want to outline a number of the apparent intelligence failures leading up to the attack, which I believe a select committee investigation would confirm. First, the State Department and CIA failed in their assessment of the militia groups working for the Americans in Benghazi, including the February 17 Martyrs Brigade, responsible for guarding the consulate property, which abandoned the Americans and may have even facilitated access to the compound for the terrorists. According to a May 21 article by Eli Lake on the Daily Beast, CIA, quote, "officers were responsible for vetting the February 17 Martyrs Brigade, the militia that was supposed to be the first responders on the night of the attack, but melted away when the diplomatic mission was attacked." Second, the State Department, the Defense Department, and the CIA apparently failed to adjust their security posture to support the Americans in Benghazi based on the growing number of attacks on Western targets in Benghazi during the summer of 2012. To date, no one has explained or been held accountable for why the U.S. mission was so poorly secured, despite pleas for assistance from the embassy staff in Tripoli to Washington. No one has adequately explained why the Defense Department's emergency response team was on a routine training mission in Croatia during the week of September 11, when it should have been on alert to respond, especially given the threats to the U.S. Embassy in Cairo and Egypt earlier in the day before the Benghazi attack. So the team, the emergency response team, was on a training mission in Croatia on the very time, the date that everyone knows, September 11th. And given the threats to the embassy, it is shocking that this is the case. Third, the intelligence community apparently failed to understand the size and scope of the attack brewing in Benghazi in the months leading up to September 11. As Chairman Rogers acknowledged to Fox News' Catherine Herridge last week, this was a well-coordinated attack that was many weeks, if not months, in the making. Earlier this year, CNN reported on the number of foreign fighters that arrived in Benghazi to participate in the attack in the days leading up to September 11. A witness in the 60-minute report noted how black al-Qaeda flags were openly flying in the months before the attack, and also noted the announced threat against U.S., British, and Red Cross facilities. How did the government miss these warnings? Or were they just simply ignored? Fourth, the intelligence community seemed to have more broadly failed to understand and anticipate how al-Qaeda was metastasizing in North Africa. The administration has been quick to take credit for the raid that killed Osama bin Laden in May 2011 and declared throughout the 2012 presidential campaign that as a result of its efforts that, quote, core al-Qaeda, end of quote, has been decimated. However, the facts don't support the administration's narrative. A CNN report on Monday said terrorist attacks hit a record high in 2012 and, quote, more than 8,500 terrorist attacks killed more than 15,500 people last year as violence tore through Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, end of quote. Increasingly, this includes North African countries like Libya. CNN also said, quote, despite the death of Osama bin Laden and the capture of other key al-Qaeda leaders, the group has exported its brand of terrorism to other militant Muslims, end of quote. These groups include affiliates like Ansar al-Sharia in Libya. Additionally, CBS' Lara Logan noted earlier this week, following her report on Benghazi, that, quote, it became evident to us during the course of our research, this is what she said, that very little is known publicly about the true nature of al-Qaeda's network in Libya, and that has consequences beyond Benghazi and beyond Libya. It has consequences that speak to the national security interests of the United States of America, end of quote. Most of these affiliate terrorist groups have sworn an allegiance to al-Qaeda and appear to closely coordinate their activities and plots with a core al-Qaeda leadership, including Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's successor. To dismiss or minimize the relationship with al-Qaeda senior leadership is misguided and I believe dangerous, as we have seen over the last several years. I fear that this administration's insistence in treating core al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan differently than groups like Ansar al-Sharia in Libya has led to a dangerous mischaracterization of the threat and has apparently resulted in a failure to anticipate attacks like the one that occurred in Benghazi. Fifth, it appears that documents were taken from the consulate and CIA annex in Benghazi in the wake of the attacks. As I said earlier, 60 Minutes reported that terrorist Faraj al-Shabalabi, whose ties to bin Laden go back nearly 2 decades, is, quote, believed to have carried documents from the compound to the head of al-Qaeda in Pakistan, end of quote. What was taken from the consulate and annex and given to al-Qaeda's leadership? We don't know. Additionally, as Lara Logan noted following her report, quote, we did not expect that we would find the U.S. compound in the state that we found it. There was still debris and ammunition boxes and a whiteboard that had the day's assignment for the security personnel at the compound as of September 11, 2012, end of quote. Clearly, in the chaos of the fighting and evacuation that night, information was left behind at the facilities that may have consequences for Americans operating in the region. I also believe the administration's response to the Benghazi attack over the last year has been nothing short of shameful, and that also merits a full investigation by a select committee. First, from the first hours of the attack, when it became apparent that no help was coming to assist those under attack, either from U.S. forces or from our allies in the region, to the failure of the FBI to gain access to key suspects in Tunisia and Egypt over the last year, this administration has sent a signal to terrorists that the U.S. will not strongly respond to an attack on Americans abroad. The failure to either arrest or kill any of the scores of terrorists responsible for the attacks more than a year later is inexcusable and reflects unwillingness by this administration to bring diplomatic pressure to bear on countries harboring these terrorists. I'm increasingly convinced that this administration is more comfortable using the ongoing FBI investigation as an excuse not to answer questions than they are in bringing these terrorists to justice. As I said on the House floor in July last year, Tunisia detained the first suspect in the Benghazi terrorist attacks, Ali Harsi, after he was deported from Turkey in the weeks following the attacks. Tunisia, despite being a beneficiary of more than $300 million of U.S. foreign aid, American taxpayer money, over $300 million, goes to Tunisia. They refused to allow the FBI access to this suspect for nearly 5 weeks. It was only after congressional threats to cut off the aid that the government of Tunisia reconsidered its position. Ultimately, the FBI interrogation team returned to Tunisia and was allowed just 3 hours to interview Harsi with his lawyer and a Tunisian judge present. Not long after the FBI interview, Harsi was inexplicably released by Tunisian authorities, and his release was celebrated by Ansar al-Sharia terrorists. Last month, it was confirmed that Harsi has been involved in at least one assassination of a Tunisian political leader. In another equally concerning case in Egypt, the FBI has been denied access to Muhammad Jamal, an al-Qaeda-connected terrorist who ran training camps in Egypt and eastern Libya prior to the Benghazi attack. Several of Jamal's associates are believed to have participated in the Benghazi plot, and terrorism analysts believe that Jamal may have communicated directly with Zawahiri and al-Qaeda's leadership about this and other terrorist attacks. Although Jamal has been in Egyptian custody for more than a year on other terrorism-related charges, the U.S. has never provided access to him under both the Morsi government and now the current military government. I personally delivered a letter to former Ambassador Patterson in Cairo asking the then President Morsi to provide the FBI access to Jamal and his documents. I don't believe the ambassador ever delivered the letter, and if she did, she never told me. But that in itself is very, very troubling. Jamal's connection to the Benghazi attack is particularly noteworthy given that both the U.S. and the United Nations formally, both the U.S. and the United Nations formally designated him as a terrorist earlier this month. However, in another example of the administration's aversion to discussing terrorist connections to the Benghazi attack, the UN designation clearly notes Jamal's connection to the Benghazi attack, whereas the State Department designation omits it. So the U.S. designation clearly notes Jamal's connection to Benghazi attack. The State Department omits it. The UN says, and our State Department omits it? I believe there's been pressure from the administration to omit this type of information from U.S. intelligence products. sending conflicting signals to both our allies and to countries that may have Benghazi suspects of interest to the FBI. And I have a lot of confidence in the FBI if they're just allowed to do their job. But if we're unwilling to identify their involvement in the attacks, it further erodes U.S. credibility in asking for access to these individuals. This willful blindness is disingenuous and I believe ultimately dangerous. In early January, when I offered an amendment to create a select committee to the House Rules package for the 113th Congress, Speaker Boehner told the Republican conference that he didn't believe that we had reached the threshold for a select committee. He suggested that we might get to the threshold, but the committee of jurisdiction just needed more time. That may have been the case in January, but nearly 11 months later, I think the broad support that has built up over the last year makes it clear we have more than passed the threshold for a select committee now. I believe, and I believe the American people believe, that the threshold has clearly been reached in terms of co-sponsors, endorsements, and new revelations from the press reports and the deep concern the American people have for this issue. I was particularly struck by the comments made by Ambassador Stevens' deputy Greg Hicks in the 60 Minutes piece segment on Sunday. Quote, "For us, for the people that go out into the edge to represent our country," he said, "we believe that if we get in trouble, they're coming to get us, that our back is covered. To hear that it's not," he said, "it's terrible, a terrible experience." End of quote. It is not enough for the administration to just say there's nothing more that could have been done, especially given that evidence indicates that they didn't try much at all to assist the Americans under fire in Benghazi. Mr. Speaker, it is time for a unified, bipartisan select committee. Let's get to the truth once and for all so we can find out what happened and restore the American people's confidence in congressional oversight and confidence in government. And yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.